There are names that vanish with time, kings forgotten, empires erased, battles that once shook the earth, now silent in the dust of history. And then there are names that refuse to die, names whispered across centuries, names that carry weight, fear, respect, names that force you to stop and ask, who was this person? What did they do that the world cannot forget them? Shaka Zulu is one of those names. But here's what most people don't know. The man who would become the most feared warrior king in African history didn't start as royalty. He didn't inherit armies. He wasn't born into power, prophecy, or privilege. He was born into shame. Imagine this. You're a child. Your mother has been cast out. Your father, a chief, denies you. The people around you whisper when you pass. Bastard, mistake, unwanted. You're too small, too weak, too nothing. Every day is a reminder that you don't belong, that you're the consequence of something shameful, that your very existence is an insult. Most people break under that weight. Shaka didn't break, he sharpened. This is not a story about a king who was destined for greatness. This is a story about a boy who was destined for nothing, who took that nothing and turned it into an empire. A boy who learned to endure pain, to weaponize humiliation, to study his enemies while they mocked him. And when he finally had power, he didn't just win battles, he changed the rules of war itself. But power, as Shaka would learn, is a blade with two edges. It cuts your enemies, and if you're not careful, it cuts you too. So let me ask you something. What does it take to rise from absolute disgrace to absolute dominance? What kind of mind, what kind of will, what kind of ruthlessness is required to transform yourself from an outcast into a legend? And more importantly, what does that transformation cost? Because by the time Shaka's story ends, you'll understand something profound about human nature, about ambition, about what happens when genius meets trauma, when brilliance meets brutality, when a man who was given nothing decides to take everything. This is the story of how an illegitimate child became a military genius, how scattered clans became a warrior nation, how one man's vision reshaped an entire continent. This is the rise of Shaka Zulu, the Napoleon of Africa, the king who conquered through innovation, discipline, and a weapon so simple, so deadly, that it would become legendary. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every empire begins somewhere. And Shaka's empire began in the most unlikely place imaginable. It began with a beetle. Around 1787, in the green hills of what we now call South Africa, a woman named Nandi discovered she was pregnant. This should have been a moment of joy, but it wasn't. Because the father was Senzanga, chief of a small clan called the Zulu, and Nandi was not his wife. In the rigid social world of the time, this was catastrophic. Pregnancy outside of formal marriage wasn't just frowned upon, it was unforgivable. It was a stain on honor, on family, on the entire social order. When Nandi's condition became obvious, the elders of the Zulu clan were furious. But they didn't want a scandal. So they did what people in power often do when faced with uncomfortable truth. They denied it. She's not pregnant, they said. It's just a stomach condition, an intestinal beetle. We call it Shaka. The name stuck, and when the child was born, that's what they called him, Shaka, the beetle, the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. Think about that for a moment. Your name, the very word people use to identify you, is a dismissal, a lie told to avoid embarrassment. You're not a person. You're a problem that was explained away. Senzanga, the chief, the father, wanted nothing to do with Nandi or the child. He eventually married her briefly to legitimize the situation, but it didn't last. Within a few years, Nandi and young Shaka were sent away, back to her people, the Langeni clan, exiled, unwanted. And that's where Shaka's childhood truly began, in exile, among people who saw him and his mother as burdens. Life among the Langeni was harsh. Nandi and Shaka were tolerated, not welcomed. They were dependents, charity cases. And children, as children do, sensed the vulnerability. They circled like predators. Shaka was small for his age, thin, awkward, an easy target. The other boys tormented him relentlessly. They called him names. They mocked his illegitimacy. They reminded him, every single day, that he was different, lesser, a mistake. There are accounts from oral tradition that describe Shaka during these years. A quiet boy, watchful. He didn't cry when they hit him. He didn't beg them to stop. He just endured and watched. He watched the warriors train. He studied how they moved, how they fought, how they spoke about combat. He observed the rituals of war, the throwing of spears, the formations, the tactics. And even as a child, something in his mind was working, analyzing, questioning. Why did warriors throw their spears and then have nothing left? Why did battles last so long with so few deaths? Why was war treated like a ceremonial dance instead of a science? These weren't the questions of a normal child. But Shaka wasn't interested in being normal. Normal boys fit in. Normal boys were accepted. Shaka had learned something essential in those years of humiliation. If you can't be loved, be feared. If you can't belong, dominate. If the world won't give you respect, take it. But he was just a boy. He had no power, no status, no army. All he had was observation, patience, and a growing understanding of how things worked, how people worked, how war worked. And he was learning something else too. Pain, when you stop resisting it, becomes fuel. When Shaka was around 13 or 14 years old, his mother was driven out again. The Langani had grown tired of supporting them. They were told to leave. Just like that, pack up, go. Where do you go when no one wants you? When you have no home, no protection, no place in the world? Nandi and Shaka wandered until they found refuge with a neighboring clan called the Mementos. The chief, a man named Ndwandwe, was different from other leaders. He was a visionary. He believed that the scattered, feuding clans of the region could be unified, that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that a larger political structure was possible. And critically, Ndwandwe maintained something unusual, a standing army. Not warriors who gathered for seasonal raids and then went home, an actual, organized military force that trained continuously. This was where Shaka's life changed. He was conscripted, pulled into the Mementos military as a young man, and for the first time in his life he was given structure, purpose, a chance to prove himself. The other recruits didn't know what to make of him. He was quiet, intense. He didn't boast or show off, but he trained harder than anyone else. He ran until his feet bled. He drilled until his muscles screamed. He studied every technique, every movement, every tactic. And he started to innovate. The standard weapon of the time was called an assegai, a long throwing spear with a small iron tip. Warriors carried several of these into battle. They'd throw them from a distance, hope for a hit, and then either retreat or engage in chaotic hand-to-hand combat with whatever was left. Shaka hated this system. He saw it as fundamentally flawed. Why throw your weapon away? Why fight from a distance when you could fight up close, where skill actually mattered? He began experimenting with a different kind of spear, shorter, heavier, with a broad, leaf-shaped blade designed for stabbing, not throwing. A weapon you kept in your hand. A weapon that turned you into a close-range predator. This weapon would eventually be called the Iklwa, named after the sucking sound it made when pulled from a body. But the weapon was only part of it. Shaka was also rethinking tactics. He noticed that most battles were disorganized. Warriors charged, threw spears, and then everything devolved into chaos. There was no coordination, no strategy, just individual courage and luck. Shaka started training differently. He practiced moving in formation. He drilled on how to close distance quickly. He learned to use shields not just for defense, but as weapons to knock enemies off balance. He trained his body to ignore pain, to push past exhaustion, to function like a machine. His commanders noticed. Ndwandwe himself took an interest in this unusual young warrior who fought with such precision, such intensity. Shaka rose through the ranks quickly, not because he was liked. He wasn't particularly liked. He was respected. He was effective. And effectiveness in a military organization is the ultimate currency. By his mid-20s, Shaka had become one of Ndwandwe's most trusted commanders. He'd fought in dozens of engagements. He'd studied every fighting style in the region. He'd analyzed strengths, weaknesses, patterns, and he'd come to a conclusion that would change everything. War didn't have to be what it was. It could be something else entirely, something more organized, more efficient, more devastating. War could be a tool, not just for conquest, but for transformation, for building something larger than tribes and clans, for creating a unified power that could dominate an entire region. All it required was the will to reimagine everything, and the ruthlessness to enforce that vision. Shaka didn't have an army yet. He didn't have a throne. He was still technically a subordinate in someone else's military. But he had a plan, and in 1816, fate gave him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. News traveled slowly in those days, but when it came like thunder. Ndwandwe was dead, the chief of the Zulu clan, Shaka's father, the man who had rejected him, denied him, sent him away, dead. For most people, this would be a moment of closure, perhaps grief, perhaps relief. For Shaka, it was something else entirely. An opening. The Zulu clan was small, maybe 1,500 people scattered across a handful of settlements. They were vassals of Ndwandwe's Methwa confederation, tributary but not important. By regional standards, they were nobodies. When Ndwandwe died, leadership passed to his eldest legitimate son, Sigujana. This was tradition. This was law. Shaka, the bastard, the exile, had no claim, no right, no legitimacy. But Shaka had never cared much for tradition, and he had something more valuable than legitimacy. He had Ndwandwe's backing. What happened next is murky. History filtered through generations of oral tradition and colonial reinterpretation. But the outcome is crystal clear. Sigujana didn't rule for long. Within months, he was dead, killed. Whether Shaka ordered it directly or orchestrated it from a distance, we don't know. What matters is the result. By the end of 1816, Shaka was chief of the Zulu clan. He was 30 years old, and he had just inherited a kingdom the size of a village. Most people would have been satisfied. Most people would have consolidated power, maintained the status quo, enjoyed the prestige of leadership. Shaka wasn't most people. The moment he took control, he began tearing apart everything the Zulu had been and rebuilding it according to his own design. His first move was radical. He abolished the traditional system of age-based regiments that trained together and then returned home to farm and raise families. That system created part-time warriors, men whose loyalty was split between military duty and personal life. Shaka didn't want part-time warriors. He wanted soldiers. He created a standing army. Young men were conscripted and forbidden from marrying until they proved themselves in battle. They lived in military barracks. They trained constantly. They ate together, slept together, fought together. Their loyalty wasn't to their families. It was to the Zulu nation. And the Zulu nation was Shaka. This was revolutionary. No other clan maintained a permanent military force. Shaka, within months, had thousands of men who existed solely for war. But soldiers needed weapons, and Shaka knew exactly what weapon they needed. He commissioned blacksmiths to forge his design, the short stabbing spear, the Iklwa, and he began drilling his soldiers in its use. No more throwing, no more distance fighting. You close the gap, you drive the blade into the torso. You move to the next target, efficient, ruthless, final. But a weapon is useless without training, and Shaka's training was unlike anything the region had ever seen. His soldiers ran barefoot across rocky terrain until their feet toughened like leather. They trained for hours without water. They practiced formations until they could execute them in their sleep. Mock battles where failure meant punishment. Beatings, humiliation, sometimes death. Shaka believed in two things: fear and discipline. His soldiers feared him more than they feared the enemy, and that fear made them unstoppable. He also introduced new tactics. The most famous was the horns of the buffalo. The army divided into 4 parts. The chest engaged the enemy head-on, locking them in place. The 2 horns swept around the sides, encircling from behind, and the loins, a reserve force, waited to exploit any weakness. By the time the enemy realized they were surrounded, it was too late. There was no escape, no mercy. This wasn't war as ritual, this was war as extermination. With his army trained and his tactics refined, Shaka launched his first campaigns. Small neighboring clans, groups that had once seen the Zulu as equals. They weren't prepared for what came next. Shaka's warriors struck at dawn. They moved with coordination that seemed impossible. They surrounded their enemies before they could react. They cut them down with the Iklwa before they could throw a single spear. Those who survived were given a choice: submit or die. Most submitted. But submission, in Shaka's world, didn't mean enslavement. It meant assimilation. Defeated clans were absorbed, their young men conscripted into Zulu regiments, their chiefs allowed to keep titles if they swore loyalty. Their cattle, land, identity all became part of the growing Zulu state. Shaka wasn't conquering for tribute, he was building a nation, and the nation was growing fast. Throughout these early campaigns, Shaka remained technically a vassal of Ndwandwe. He owed his position partly to Ndwandwe's support, and he was careful not to overstep. Not yet. But in 1817, everything changed. Ndwandwe was captured by a rival chief named Ndwandwe. Ndwandwe had Ndwandwe executed, his head sent back as a message. The Mementos Confederation collapsed overnight. Clans that had been united under Ndwandwe's banner scrambled for survival. Chaos spread like wildfire. And in the middle of that chaos, Shaka saw his moment. With Ndwandwe dead, Shaka was no longer a subordinate. He was a warlord. And he moved with terrifying speed to absorb what remained of the Mementos Confederation. Some clans joined willingly. They recognized that Shaka Zulu were now the strongest power. Others resisted. They were crushed. Within months, the Zulu weren't a small clan anymore. They were becoming a force that could challenge anyone in the region. But Shaka knew growth alone wasn't enough. To survive, to dominate, he would need to face the one enemy that threatened everything: Ndwandwe and the Ndwandwe. The war that was coming would determine whether Shaka's vision would endure or be destroyed. There's a moment that comes in every rising power's story, a moment where ambition meets reality, where potential meets resistance, where the new order collides with the old. For Shaka, that moment came in the form of Ndwandwe. Ndwandwe Kalanga wasn't just another clan chief. He was the ruler of the Ndwandwe, one of the most powerful confederations in the region. His army was vast, his reputation was fearsome. He had crushed Ndwandwe, he had scattered the Mementos, and now he turned his attention south, to the upstart Zulu, to Shaka. From Ndwandwe's perspective, this was simple. Shaka was a former vassal who had grown too bold. The solution? March south, destroy the Zulu, remind everyone who truly ruled. Ndwandwe didn't see Shaka as a threat. He saw him as an irritation, a problem to be solved. That miscalculation would cost him everything. Because while Ndwandwe saw a traditional war, Shaka saw something different. He saw a test, an opportunity, a chance to prove that his new way of fighting could defeat superior numbers. But he also saw a problem. The Ndwandwe outnumbered him significantly. They had more warriors, more cattle, more resources. If Shaka met them in direct battle, head-to-head, he would lose. So Shaka did something that no chief had ever done before, something that would have been considered cowardice by traditional standards. He refused to fight. When Ndwandwe's army began marching south in 1818, they expected to find the Zulu defending their territory, standing and fighting like warriors were supposed to. Instead, they found nothing. Shaka had ordered a complete evacuation. Every man, woman, child, everyone packed what they could carry and moved south into the hills. Livestock were driven ahead. Grain stores were buried or burned. Homesteads abandoned. As the Ndwandwe advanced, they marched through empty land. No food, no water, no one to fight. Just silence. This was psychological warfare. Shaka wasn't just avoiding battle. He was weaponizing the landscape itself. Every mile the Ndwandwe marched, they grew weaker, hungrier, more demoralized. Their supply lines stretched thin. Their warriors began questioning the campaign. And all the while, Shaka's scouts watched from the ridges, reporting every movement, every weakness. The Ndwandwe pushed deeper, expecting that eventually Shaka would have to stand and fight. But weeks passed, then months. The Ndwandwe army, once confident and powerful, was now exhausted, starving, falling apart. And that's when Shaka struck. He chose his ground carefully, a hill called Iklwa, steep, defensible with clear sightlines. He positioned his warriors at the top and waited. When the Ndwandwe finally saw the Zulu army arrayed before them, they must have felt relief. Finally, a battle. Finally, an end to this nightmare chase. They charged up the hill, confident in their numbers. But numbers don't matter when you can't bring them to bear. The terrain worked against the Ndwandwe. They couldn't flank. They couldn't maneuver. They could only climb, exhausted and hungry, straight into Shaka's trap. The Iklwa did its work. The buffalo horns adapted to the terrain. The chest held the center. The horns swept down the slopes, attacking the flanks. The loins surged forward to finish what the others started. By sunset, the Ndwandwe were in full retreat. Thousands dead. Survivors fleeing north, broken and leaderless. But Shaka wasn't finished. He ordered pursuit, not to capture territory, not to seize cattle, to hunt, to chase them down, to make sure the Ndwandwe understood something fundamental. You don't fight the Zulu and walk away. The pursuit was merciless. Shaka's warriors chased the Ndwandwe for miles, cutting down stragglers, burning homesteads, scattering clans. It wasn't war, it was erasure. Within a year, the Ndwandwe Confederation had collapsed. Ndwandwe fled north, eventually dying in exile. The clans that had sworn loyalty to him either submitted to Shaka or were destroyed. The balance of power had shifted, and at the center of that shift was Shaka. The victory over the Ndwandwe didn't just make Shaka powerful, it made him inevitable. Clans across the region looked at what had happened and drew the obvious conclusion. Resistance was futile. Shaka's army was too disciplined, too innovative, too ruthless. Better to join willingly than be conquered. And Shaka welcomed them, but on his terms. When a clan submitted, their young men were conscripted into Zulu regiments, not kept together as a unit, scattered, mixed with warriors from other clans, forced to train, eat, sleep, and fight alongside former rivals. Over time, something remarkable happened. These men stopped thinking of themselves by their clan names. They started thinking of themselves as Zulu. This was nation-building, not through forced subjugation, but through cultural engineering. Shaka was erasing old identities and replacing them with a new one. The regiments became the backbone of this new identity. Each regiment had a name, a reputation, a distinct shield pattern. They competed with each other for honor, for glory, for Shaka's favor. Warriors trained harder because they didn't want to shame their regiment. They fought harder because they wanted to prove their regiment was the best. But the regiments were more than military units. They were instruments of social control. By forbidding warriors to marry until they'd proven themselves in battle, Shaka ensured they remained loyal to the state rather than to families. By keeping them in barracks, he prevented regional loyalties from forming. The warrior's world was the army, and the army's world was Shaka. This system was brutal. It denied young men the normal rhythms of life: marriage, children, home. But it also gave them something intoxicating: glory, purpose, the chance to be part of something greater. And for many, that was enough. As the Zulu kingdom expanded, Shaka faced the challenge every empire faces: how to maintain control over a vast, diverse population. His solution was centralization: total, complete, absolute centralization. All decisions flowed through Shaka. He didn't delegate real power to regional governors. He didn't let his generals operate independently. He rotated commanders frequently to prevent them from building personal power bases. He maintained a network of informants, people who reported directly to him, who told him about dissent, disloyalty, rebellion. This system was effective, but it was also exhausting. Shaka was everywhere, seeing everything, controlling everything. He rose before dawn, held court all day, planned campaigns into the night. He was the state, and the state was him. His subjects, whether they loved him or feared him, couldn't imagine the Zulu without him. But there was a problem that would eventually consume everything Shaka had built. The system required constant expansion. The economy ran on captured cattle and tribute from conquered clans. Warriors expected rewards. Regiments expected glory. The moment the Zulu stopped expanding, the entire structure would begin to crumble. Shaka understood this, but he showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, he accelerated. By 1824, the Zulu controlled territory the size of a small European nation. Shaka was planning even larger campaigns, looking north, looking at territories beyond easy reach. But there was something else happening, something subtle, something dangerous. Shaka was changing. Success does something to people, especially success built on violence. It can intoxicate, it can corrupt, it can convince you that the rules don't apply to you anymore. Shaka had always been ruthless, but now there was an edge of paranoia to his rule. He saw threats everywhere, in his generals' eyes, in his advisors' silences, in his subjects' whispers. Executions became more frequent, more arbitrary. A soldier who didn't show proper respect could be killed immediately. A chief who arrived late could be accused of disloyalty and executed with his entire family. Even Shaka's closest companions weren't safe. He tested their loyalty constantly, setting traps, asking impossible questions, watching for hesitation. This atmosphere kept the kingdom in line. But it also bred resentment. Loyalty born from terror is fragile, and Shaka, for all his genius, didn't seem to realize he was slowly eroding his own foundation. In 1824, something new arrived. Europeans, British traders, seeking to establish a post on the coast near what's now Durban. They'd heard rumors of a powerful African king, an army that could crush anything in its path. They came seeking trade, diplomacy, perhaps adventure. They found Shaka. The Europeans were fascinated. They marveled at the size and discipline of Shaka's army. They witnessed drills that seemed choreographed. They attended ceremonies where thousands of warriors moved in perfect unison. Shaka, for his part, was curious about their technology, their guns, their ships, their tools. He saw opportunity and threat in equal measure. He gave them land for a settlement, provided cattle and protection. But he kept them at arm's length. He didn't trust them, and he made sure they knew it. Still, their arrival was significant. It marked the beginning of something larger, an era where African kingdoms would have to contend not just with each other, but with powers from across oceans. Powers with resources and technologies beyond comprehension. Shaka understood this, at least partly. He knew the world was changing. He knew his kingdom, for all its strength, wasn't invincible. But he believed he could adapt, learn from the Europeans, take what was useful, discard the rest. He was wrong, but he wouldn't live long enough to see how wrong he was. By 1826, Shaka stood at the absolute height of his power. His kingdom stretched thousands of square miles. His army numbered close to 50,000 warriors. His name was spoken from the Cape to the Zambezi. He had achieved what no African leader of his time had managed: a centralized, militarized state capable of projecting power across vast distances. He'd taken scattered clans and forged them into a nation. He'd revolutionized warfare. He'd built an empire. But empires are easier to build than maintain, and the qualities that make someone a great conqueror, ruthlessness, single-mindedness, refusal to compromise, can become liabilities in peacetime. Shaka was about to discover this truth in the most devastating way possible, because the true test of a king isn't how he gains power, it's how he holds it, how he governs, how he adapts when the circumstances change. And Shaka's circumstances were about to change dramatically. The Zulu state had become a machine built entirely around war. Every aspect of life supported the military, and the military existed to expand and defend. But with fewer enemies to conquer, with fewer spoils to distribute, the machine was starting to strain. Warriors who'd spent years in barracks were growing restless. Chiefs were growing tired of Shaka's paranoia. Even within the royal family, tensions simmered. Shaka's half-brothers, sons of Senzangakona, with legitimate claims, held positions of honor but no real authority. They commanded regiments at Shaka's pleasure. They were princes in name, prisoners in practice. And they were watching, waiting, wondering how long this could last. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would come not from external enemies or military defeat. It would come from something far more personal, something that would break Shaka in ways that no battle ever could. It would come from loss. In October 1827, Nandi fell ill, Shaka's mother, the woman who had endured exile with him, who had protected him when the world rejected him, the one person who had stood by him unconditionally. She was dying. Shaka summoned every healer, every diviner, every expert he could find. He offered cattle, treasures, anything that might save her. Nothing worked. On October 10th, 1827, Nandi died, and something inside Shaka shattered. What happened next would shock even his own people, would horrify the Europeans watching from the coast, would mark the beginning of the end. Shaka declared a period of mourning, unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. But this wasn't mourning. This was something else entirely. This was a descent into madness. He ordered that no crops be planted for a year, no milk consumed. Any woman found pregnant was to be killed along with her husband, because pregnancy meant they hadn't been consumed by grief. Thousands of cattle were slaughtered. The royal kraal became a place of constant wailing. Warriors were forced to weep publicly. Those whose grief seemed insufficient were executed. But this wasn't enough for Shaka. He lashed out at everyone. Servants killed for not crying convincingly. Chiefs executed for arriving late to funeral rites. Anyone whose sorrow seemed inadequate was deemed disloyal and put to death. The European trader Henry Francis Finn later estimated that over 7,000 people were killed during the mourning period. Whether that number is accurate or not, it speaks to the scale of horror. But even mass execution wasn't enough to satisfy Shaka's anguish. He decided that the world needed to feel his pain, that other families needed to experience loss. He ordered his regiments to launch raids, not for territory or cattle, simply to kill, to create mourning in other families. The raids served no strategic purpose. They were acts of pure destruction, born from a king's inability to process grief. His warriors obeyed. But with growing unease, this wasn't war, this was slaughter for its own sake, and it went on for months. By mid-1828, the Zulu kingdom was in crisis. The economy devastated, food scarce, an atmosphere of terror making governance impossible. Shaka, once the brilliant strategist who'd unified a nation, had become a tyrant consumed by his own demons. He retreated into the royal kraal, surrounded by advisors too terrified to contradict him. He stopped listening, stopped planning. His decisions became arbitrary and contradictory. The machine was breaking down, and the men who had once followed him loyally were beginning to ask a dangerous question: how long could this go on? Among those asking were Shaka's half-brothers, Ndwandwe and Malangana. They'd watched their brother's descent with growing alarm. They'd seen the kingdom crumble under the weight of his grief. And they'd come to a conclusion: Shaka had to go. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Killing a king was ultimate treason. If they failed, they'd be executed along with everyone connected to them. But if they succeeded, they could save the kingdom. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. They weren't alone. A servant named Mbofa, one of Shaka's most trusted attendants, had also grown disillusioned. He'd carried out countless orders, been loyal for years, but he too had seen the madness. The three men began to plot, meeting in secret, whispering in shadows, planning carefully. They knew they'd have only one chance. If Shaka suspected anything, they were dead. They waited for the right moment. And in September 1828, that moment came. September 22nd, 1828. The day began like any other in the royal kraal. Shaka conducted routine business, met with traders, made decisions. The army was away on another raid in the north, which meant the kraal was less heavily guarded than usual. A small window of vulnerability. Ndwandwe, Malangana, and Mbofa knew this was their moment. They'd never get another chance like this. The accounts of what happened next vary depending on who's telling the story. Colonial records, oral histories, each version slightly different, but the core narrative remains consistent. The three men approached Shaka near the kraal. They carried short, stabbing spears, the Iklwa, the very weapon Shaka had invented, the weapon that had made the Zulu unstoppable. Now it would be used against him. Mbofa struck first. The spear drove into Shaka's side. Shaka, stunned, tried to defend himself. But Ndwandwe and Malangana attacked as well. Multiple wounds, deep, fatal. Shaka fell, blood pooling beneath him. And as he lay dying, according to some accounts, he looked at his assassins and said something that would echo through history. "You will rule over nothing. The white men are coming. They will be your rulers." Whether he actually said this, we can't know for certain. Memory distorts, legend embellishes, but the prophecy, accurate or invented, would haunt the Zulu for generations to come. Within minutes, Shaka Zulu was dead. The man who had risen from nothing, who had transformed scattered clans into an empire, who had revolutionized warfare, who had become a legend, gone. The king, who seemed invincible, had been killed by the people closest to him, not by external enemies, not in glorious battle, but by betrayal, in the shadows, by family. It's a reminder of something fundamental about power. The higher you rise, the more people have reason to pull you down. And the more you rule through fear, the more that fear eventually turns inward. Ndwandwe and Malangana moved quickly. They announced Shaka's death, but didn't immediately admit to killing him. They implied it had been natural, perhaps some unknown conspiracy. But everyone knew the truth. When the warriors returned from campaign and found their king dead, reactions were mixed. Some regiments were angry, loyal to Shaka even in death. Others were relieved, glad the madness had ended. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. Ndwandwe, the more politically shrewd of the two brothers, acted decisively. He began distributing cattle to warriors, easing the mourning restrictions, promising a return to normalcy. He also quietly had Malangana killed. Whether Malangana posed a genuine threat or whether Ndwandwe simply wanted to eliminate a rival, we don't know. But the message was clear. Ndwandwe was now sole ruler of the Zulu. The transition wasn't smooth. Several chiefs challenged his legitimacy. Some regiments refused to acknowledge his authority. But Ndwandwe controlled the royal kraal. He commanded the largest regiments. And he had the tacit support of those who'd grown tired of Shaka's tyranny. Within months, the crisis passed. Ndwandwe was king, and the Zulu kingdom, battered but intact, continued. But something had changed. The energy, The momentum, the sense of inevitability that had surrounded Shaka, that was gone. Shaka's body was buried in secret, an unmarked grave, the exact location never publicly revealed. Some say it was near his mother's resting place, others claim it was hidden to prevent desecration. To this day, no one knows for certain where Shaka Zulu is buried. The man who built a kingdom, who changed the face of southern Africa, who became a legend in his own lifetime, he vanished into the earth without a trace. But his legacy didn't vanish with him. Ndwandwe ruled for over a decade. He wasn't the military genius Shaka had been, but he was competent. He maintained the core structures Shaka had built, the standing army, the centralized administration, the regimental system. But he also faced something Shaka had only begun to confront: Europeans. In the 1830s, Dutch-speaking colonists called voortrekkers began migrating into the interior, fleeing British rule at the Cape, looking for land, for freedom, for opportunity. They entered Zulu territory. Ndwandwe tried to manage them the way Shaka had managed the early traders, through diplomacy and intimidation. But the voortrekkers weren't traders, they were settlers, and they were armed with guns, wagons, and a sense of entitlement. In 1838, tensions exploded. Ndwandwe ordered the execution of a voortrekker delegation, fearing they were planning to seize Zulu land. In retaliation, the voortrekkers launched a military campaign. At the Battle of Blood River in December 1838, a small force of voortrekkers, armed with rifles and positioned behind defensive wagons, defeated a massive Zulu army. For the first time, the Zulu military machine, the tactics Shaka had perfected, the formations that had made them unstoppable, had been decisively beaten. By European firearms, by defensive tactics, by technology, the myth of Zulu invincibility shattered. Ndwandwe survived a few more years, but his authority was weakened. In 1840, he was overthrown by another of Shaka's half-brothers, Mpande, who allied with the voortrekkers to seize power. Mpande ruled for over 30 years, maintaining fragile peace with the European settlers, but the Zulu kingdom was no longer the dominant regional power. It was one power among many, and the Europeans were growing stronger. In 1879, 50 years after Shaka's death, the Zulu faced their greatest challenge: war with the British Empire. The British, who'd consolidated control over much of southern Africa, viewed the Zulu as a threat. They issued an ultimatum: disband the Zulu army and submit to British authority. The Zulu, now ruled by King Cetshwayo, refused. What followed was the Anglo-Zulu War, a conflict that showcased both the enduring brilliance of Shaka's military legacy and the inevitable limitations of traditional warfare against industrialized colonial powers. At the Battle of Ndwandwe in January 1879, a Zulu force of approximately 20,000 warriors annihilated a British column of over 1,700 soldiers. Using tactics Shaka had pioneered: the buffalo horns, disciplined coordination, rapid encirclement. The Iklwa that Shaka had invented still proved deadly. The regimental system he'd created still functioned with devastating efficiency. For a moment, it seemed the Zulu military tradition might be unstoppable. But Ndwandwe was followed by Rauke's Drift, where a tiny British garrison held off thousands of Zulu warriors through superior firepower. And 6 months later, at the Battle of Ulundi, the British brought overwhelming force: artillery, cavalry, Gatling guns. They crushed the Zulu army decisively. The Zulu kingdom was annexed. Cetshwayo was captured and exiled. The army Shaka had built was disbanded. The nation he'd forged was divided into 13 separate territories, each ruled by chiefs loyal to the British. The age of Zulu military dominance was over, but Shaka's influence didn't end with the fall of the kingdom. The Mfecane, the scattering of peoples that Shaka's military expansion had triggered, it reshaped southern Africa for generations. Displaced clans fled in every direction: north, south, east, west. They invaded neighboring territories, which triggered more displacement, more violence, more migration. The ripple effects spread across an area the size of Western Europe. Some refugees formed their own military states, modeling themselves on Shaka Zulu, Mzilikazi, a former Zulu general who'd fled after a dispute with Shaka, founded the Matabele kingdom in what's now Zimbabwe. Soshangane carved out a kingdom in Mozambique. Zwangendaba led his people on a migration that took them as far north as Tanzania. These kingdoms adopted variations of Shaka's military system, his tactics, his centralized governance, his regimental structures. In this sense, Shaka didn't just build a kingdom, he created a template that spread across half a continent. He demonstrated that African societies could organize into powerful centralized states, that African military tactics could rival external powers, that leadership, strategy, and innovation could overcome material disadvantages. These lessons weren't lost on future generations of African leaders, both during colonialism and in the independence struggles that followed. The comparison between Shaka and Napoleon has been made by historians for over a century, and it's apt. Both rose from relatively humble origins to become military geniuses who reshaped their regions. Both revolutionized warfare, both built empires through strategic brilliance, ruthless discipline, and personal charisma. Napoleon transformed European warfare through mobile artillery, rapid movements, and the corps system. Shaka transformed African warfare through the Iklwa, close combat tactics, and a standing professional army. Napoleon conquered most of Europe before his ambitions exceeded his resources. Shaka conquered southeastern Africa before his kingdom hit economic limits. Both were brilliant administrators who created systems that outlasted them. Both were ruthless leaders who inspired fanatical loyalty while terrifying their subjects. Both died in circumstances that marked the end of their empires. Napoleon on St. Helena, Shaka in an unmarked grave. But there are critical differences. Napoleon operated in a world of established nation-states, written laws, centuries of military theory. Shaka operated in a world of oral tradition, clan-based societies, warfare as ritual. Napoleon had gunpowder weapons, modern logistics, literate officers. Shaka worked with Iron Age technology, cattle-based economics, oral command structures. That Shaka achieved what he did with the resources available makes his accomplishments, in some ways, even more remarkable. Over the decades and centuries since his death, Shaka has become as much myth as man. Different groups have claimed him for different purposes. To some, he's a symbol of African resistance against colonialism, a leader who proved African peoples could build powerful states and field formidable armies. To others, he's a cautionary tale about militarism and authoritarianism, a tyrant whose quest for power brought suffering to millions. To the Zulu people themselves, Shaka occupies a complex position. He's honored as the founder of the nation, the man who took scattered clans and forged them into a unified kingdom. But he's also remembered as a harsh ruler whose later years were marked by cruelty and madness. The truth is more complicated than any single narrative. Shaka was a product of his time and place, a world of constant warfare, fluid borders, survival of the fittest politics. He was brilliant, innovative, visionary. He was also brutal, paranoid, ultimately self-destructive. He built a kingdom that lasted barely a decade under his rule but influenced a region for centuries. He created a military system studied by European officers and emulated by African leaders. He became a legend whose name is still spoken with reverence and fear. It's important to acknowledge that much of what we know about Shaka comes from European sources, traders, missionaries, colonial officials who viewed him through the lens of their own prejudices. These accounts often exaggerated his cruelty while downplaying his strategic genius. They portrayed him as a savage tyrant rather than a sophisticated political leader. This colonial narrative served a purpose. It justified European conquest by painting African rulers as barbaric despots whose subjects needed saving through colonization. Modern scholarship has worked to correct these distortions. Using oral histories, archaeological evidence, comparative analysis, we now understand that the Zulu state was a complex political entity with sophisticated systems of governance, law, and social organization. We also understand that the violence attributed to Shaka, while real, wasn't exceptional for his time. The early 19th century was a period of upheaval across southern Africa, driven by drought, population pressure, the expanding slave trade. Shaka's militarism was both cause and consequence of this broader instability. This doesn't excuse the atrocities committed under his rule, but it does place them in context, allowing us to see Shaka as a human being shaped by circumstances rather than as a one-dimensional monster or hero. Today, Shaka Zulu remains a powerful symbol in South Africa and beyond. His image appears on currency, monuments, public buildings. His name is invoked in political speeches, cultural celebrations, academic debates. He's claimed by Zulu nationalists as a symbol of ethnic pride, by Pan-Africanists as an icon of African achievement, by South Africans of all backgrounds as part of their shared history. But Shaka's legacy is also contested. Some see the celebration of a militaristic ruler as problematic in a democracy trying to move beyond its violent past. Others argue that focusing on Shaka's brutality while ignoring his achievements plays into colonial narratives that diminished African accomplishments. These debates reflect deeper questions. How do societies remember their pasts? Which histories do they celebrate? Which do they critique? They remind us that historical figures like Shaka aren't just subjects of academic study, they're living symbols whose meanings change with each generation. Despite centuries of research, many questions about Shaka remain unanswered. We don't know exactly when he was born. We don't know where he's buried. We don't have his own words, his own account. Everything we know comes from second-hand sources, some reliable, some dubious, all filtered through the biases of their authors. We don't know what Shaka truly thought about the Europeans, whether he saw them as potential allies or inevitable enemies. We don't know whether he had a long-term plan for the Zulu state or whether he was improvising as he went. We don't know if his descent into violence after his mother's death was a character flaw or a tragic response to unbearable grief. These gaps in our knowledge are frustrating, but they're also, in a way, appropriate, because Shaka, for all his historical importance, remains fundamentally unknowable, a figure whose inner life we can only guess at, whose true motivations we can only infer. He is what all great historical figures eventually become, a mirror in which each generation sees its own concerns reflected back. So who was Shaka Zulu? What is his place in the grand sweep of human history? Strip away the mythology, strip away the colonial distortions, strip away the nationalist narratives. What remains? A man who understood something fundamental about power, that it doesn't come from birthright. It comes from mastery, from discipline, from the willingness to reimagine everything and the ruthlessness to enforce that vision. Shaka was a military innovator who changed how wars were fought across an entire region. He looked at traditional warfare and saw inefficiency, waste, ritual disguised as strategy. And he tore it all down and rebuilt it from first principles. The Iklwa wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. War should be personal, close, decisive. No more throwing spears from a distance and hoping. You close the gap, you drive the blade home, you move to the next target. The buffalo horns wasn't just a formation, it was a system, a way of thinking about combat as coordination rather than chaos, as chess rather than dice. The standing army wasn't just an organizational choice, it was a revolution. Warriors who lived, breathed, and existed solely for war, who owed loyalty not to families or clans, but to the state, to the king. These innovations spread. They were studied, copied, adapted. European military officers analyzed Zulu tactics. African leaders emulated Zulu structures. The ripples spread across continents and centuries. But Shaka was more than just a military mind. He was a state builder. He took scattered clans with different languages, different customs, different loyalties, and he forged them into a nation, not through gentle persuasion, through cultural engineering, through systematic dismantling of old identities and construction of new ones, through mixing warriors from different clans until they forgot where they came from and remembered only where they were going. This was nation-building as alchemy, taking disparate elements and transforming them into something unified, something powerful, something that could project force across vast distances and maintain cohesion despite rapid expansion. The Zulu state that Shaka created lasted barely more than a decade under his rule, but it set a template. It proved something important, that African societies could organize into centralized states, that they could field professional armies, that they could rival any power on earth when it came to military effectiveness. These weren't small achievements. These were demonstrations of what was possible, proof that leadership and innovation could overcome material disadvantages. But let's talk about the other side, because there's always another side. Shaka built his kingdom on violence, conquest, fear. Thousands died in his campaigns, entire clans were scattered. The Mfecane, the upheaval his expansion triggered, destabilized southern Africa for decades. His rule, especially in those final years, was marked by paranoia, arbitrary executions, terror as governance. People lived in constant fear of displeasing him, of being accused of disloyalty, of being killed for reasons they couldn't predict or control. The mourning period after Nandi's death was catastrophic. Thousands executed, economic devastation. A kingdom brought to the brink of collapse by one man's inability to process grief. This wasn't leadership, this was tyranny, and it's important to name it as such. The system Shaka built was unsustainable. It required constant expansion, constant conquest, constant distribution of spoils. The moment it stopped growing, it began eating itself. Young men spent the best years of their lives in military barracks, forbidden from marrying, forbidden from building normal lives. Women bore the economic burden of keeping homesteads running, while men fought endless wars. This was a society organized entirely around military power, and while that made the Zulu formidable in the short term, it created deep structural problems that would eventually contribute to the kingdom's fall. So when we talk about Shaka's legacy, we have to hold both truths simultaneously. He was brilliant and brutal, visionary and tyrannical. He built something remarkable and destroyed countless lives in the process. He was, in the end, deeply human, shaped by trauma, the illegitimate child who never forgot the humiliation, who built an empire partly to prove his worth to a world that had rejected him. He understood pain, he'd endured it as a child, and he learned to weaponize it, to use it as fuel, to channel it into discipline, into strategy, into conquest. But he never healed from it, and in the end, when his mother died and he lost the one person who'd stood by him unconditionally, that unhealed trauma consumed him. It's a reminder that personal wounds, no matter how much power you accumulate, don't disappear. They just manifest in different ways, sometimes in ways that destroy everything you've built. There's a question that historians and philosophers have debated for centuries. What do we owe to those who achieve greatness through morally troubling methods? How do we honor accomplishment while acknowledging atrocity? How do we tell the truth about the past without reducing complex human beings to simplistic heroes or villains? These aren't easy questions, and there are no universal answers. Some argue that we should judge historical figures by the standards of their time, that Shaka's violence wasn't exceptional for early 19th century southern Africa, that survival often required ruthlessness, that mercy was seen as weakness. Others argue that some moral principles transcend time and culture, that mass executions are wrong regardless of context, that tyranny is tyranny whether it happens in ancient Rome or modern times. Both perspectives have merit, And perhaps the answer lies in holding both simultaneously. We can acknowledge that Shaka was a product of his circumstances, a world of constant warfare, fluid borders, survival of the fittest politics, where the choice was often dominate or be dominated, conquer or be conquered. We can also acknowledge that his choices caused immense suffering, that his paranoia and cruelty, especially in his later years, crossed lines that even his contemporaries found disturbing. We can study his military innovations while condemning his excesses. We can appreciate his nation-building while mourning those who died in the process. History isn't about picking sides, it's about understanding, about seeing human beings in all their complexity, about recognizing that the same person can be both brilliant and cruel, visionary and destructive. Shaka was all of these things, and his story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about leadership, about what it takes to change the world. If you're part of Mementos historians, you understand why stories like this matter, why we dig into the complicated, messy, difficult parts of history that others might prefer to simplify or ignore. Because the truth is always more interesting than the myth. The real human being is always more compelling than the sanitized hero or the one-dimensional villain. Shaka's story is worth telling not because he was perfect, but because he was profoundly imperfect. Because his life illustrates something fundamental about human nature, about what we're capable of, both the heights of achievement and the depths of cruelty. His story reminds us that genius and madness can coexist in the same person, that trauma can drive extraordinary accomplishment and extraordinary destruction, that the qualities that make someone a great conqueror, ruthlessness, single-mindedness, refusal to compromise, can become fatal flaws when circumstances change. These are lessons that transcend time and culture. They apply to leaders in any era, to anyone who seeks power, to anyone who tries to change the world. Today, nearly 200 years after his death, Shaka Zulu remains relevant. His tactics are still studied in military academies. His state-building strategies are still analyzed by political scientists. His life is still debated by historians, invoked by politicians, reinterpreted by each new generation. But perhaps the most important aspect of Shaka's legacy isn't what he built, it's what he proved. He proved that African societies could produce military geniuses every bit as brilliant as their European or Asian counterparts. He proved that innovation and strategy could overcome technological disadvantages. He proved that leadership mattered profoundly, that individuals could shape history. These might seem like obvious points now, but in an era of colonial conquest, when European powers were justifying their domination by claiming African inferiority, Shaka's achievements were powerful counter-evidence. The British officers who fought the Zulu in 1879, 50 years after Shaka's death, were forced to acknowledge that they were facing a sophisticated military force, one that had been organized by an African genius, one that nearly defeated them despite massive technological disadvantages. That acknowledgement, however grudging, mattered. It chipped away at the racist assumptions that underpinned colonialism. It demonstrated what many Europeans didn't want to admit, that Africans were just as capable of brilliance, of organization, of military sophistication as anyone else. Let's return to where we started, with a question. What does it take to rise from absolute disgrace to absolute dominance? We've seen the answer now. It takes intelligence, strategic thinking, the ability to see what others miss and reimagine what others take for granted. It takes discipline, the willingness to train harder, endure more, push beyond what seems possible. It takes ruthlessness, the capacity to make hard decisions, to prioritize power over popularity, victory over mercy. But it also takes something else, something darker. It takes unhealed trauma, the kind of wound that never stops aching, that drives you forward because standing still means feeling the pain. Shaka rose from nothing because he refused to accept that nothing was his destiny. He was mocked, humiliated, rejected, and instead of breaking, he transformed that rejection into fuel. Every insult became motivation. Every slight became a reminder of why he needed to succeed. Every moment of powerlessness became a lesson in how power worked and how to take it. This is the alchemy of ambition, taking pain and transmuting it into achievement. And it works. It can drive someone to extraordinary heights. But it comes with a cost, because pain that's never processed doesn't disappear, it accumulates, it festers, and eventually it explodes. For Shaka, that explosion came when Nandi died. The one person who'd stood by him. The one person whose love was unconditional. When she was gone, all that unprocessed pain had nowhere to go except outward. Into violence, into madness, into the destruction of everything he'd built. It's a tragedy in the truest sense. Not because Shaka was innocent, he wasn't, but because his downfall was built into his rise. The very qualities that made him great, his inability to accept weakness, his refusal to trust, his drive to control everything, ultimately destroyed him. Empires rise and fall. Kings are born and die, armies march and are forgotten. But every so often, a figure emerges who changes not just the political landscape, but the very way we think about what's possible. Shaka Zulu was one of those figures. He took a minor clan and built a kingdom. He took traditional warfare and revolutionized it. He took scattered peoples and forged them into a nation. He rose from exile to become one of the most powerful rulers in Africa, and he did it all with discipline, strategy, and a spear. His reign lasted barely more than a decade. His kingdom fell within a generation of his death. But his influence rippled across southern Africa for centuries, shaping societies, inspiring leaders, forcing the world to recognize that African civilizations could produce military geniuses, sophisticated states, and transformative leaders. Today, his story is taught in schools, analyzed by historians, invoked in political discourse. He's remembered, argued over, reinterpreted by each new generation. Because Shaka's story isn't just about one man or one kingdom. It's about what human beings are capable of, both the heights of achievement and the depths of cruelty. It's about how societies organize in times of crisis. It's about the relationship between individual genius and historical forces. It's about power, its uses and its limits, its seductions and its costs. And it's a reminder that history isn't made by nations or movements or impersonal forces alone. It's made by people, complex, flawed, brilliant, tragic people who make choices that echo through centuries. Shaka Zulu made his choices. He built his empire. He left his mark on history. And the world has never forgotten his name. The boy who was named after a beetle, who was cast out and humiliated, who had every reason to disappear into obscurity, that boy became a king who changed the course of African history. He proved that origins don't determine destiny, that disadvantage can be overcome, that one person with enough will and vision can reshape the world. But he also proved something else, that power without wisdom is dangerous, that conquest without purpose is hollow, that genius without compassion ultimately consumes itself. These are the lessons of Shaka's life, and they remain relevant today. In every boardroom where someone chases power without considering the cost, in every conflict where violence becomes the only language, in every leader who confuses domination with greatness, Shaka's story is a mirror, and what we see in it says as much about us as it does about him. Do we see a hero who overcame impossible odds, or a tyrant who caused immense suffering? Do we see a military genius or a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition? The answer is all of the above. Because human beings are never just one thing, we're contradictions, capable of both creation and destruction, both brilliance and cruelty. And the greatest figures in history are often those who embody these contradictions most completely. So here's what I want you to take away from Shaka's story. Greatness is possible. Rising from nothing is possible. Changing the world is possible. One person with vision and determination can accomplish extraordinary things. But greatness without character is dangerous. Power without accountability is tyranny. Success without wisdom is fragile. The true measure of a leader isn't just what they build, it's what they leave behind. Not just in terms of institutions or territories, but in terms of people. How did their subjects live? What kind of society did they create? What values did they embody? On these measures, Shaka's record is mixed. He built a nation that outlasted him, but he also left a trail of suffering. He created military innovations that changed warfare, but he also created a system that consumed itself. He was brilliant, and he was brutal, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That brilliance alone isn't enough. That innovation alone isn't enough. That power alone isn't enough. What matters is what you do with it, how you wield it, what kind of world you create. Shaka Zulu created a world of warriors, of discipline and conquest, of expansion and domination. It was impressive. It was formidable. It changed history. But it couldn't last, because systems built on violence eventually turn that violence inward, because empires that exist only for war eventually run out of enemies, because leaders who rule through fear eventually find themselves alone. And that's how Shaka's story ends. Not in glorious battle, not in peaceful old age, but in an unmarked grave. Killed by the people closest to him, brought down not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions of what he'd built. It's a sobering reminder that even the greatest leaders are mortal, that even the mightiest empires are temporary, that power, no matter how absolute, is always fragile. But it's also a reminder of something else, that individuals matter, that choices matter, that leadership, for good or ill, shapes the world. Shaka Zulu shaped his world more than most. He left a mark that 2 centuries haven't erased. His name is still spoken, his story is still told, his legacy is still debated, and that, perhaps, is the ultimate measure of historical significance. Not whether you were loved or hated, not whether you were right or wrong, but whether you mattered, whether your life changed the trajectory of human history. By that measure, Shaka Zulu absolutely mattered. He rose from shame to create an empire. He transformed warfare across a continent. He proved what one person could accomplish against overwhelming odds. He was brilliant, brutal, visionary, and tragic. He was profoundly human, and his story, for all its complexity and contradiction, deserves to be remembered. Not as myth, not as propaganda, but as truth. Complicated, fascinating, and profoundly relevant. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, if it challenged you to see history differently, then here's what I need you to do. Don't let stories like this disappear. Don't let the complicated, messy, difficult truths of history get simplified into comfortable narratives, like this video. Not because I need the algorithm boost, though I do, but because engagement tells platforms that complex, thoughtful content matters. That people want more than surface-level takes, that real history, with all its contradictions, deserves attention. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think about Shaka's legacy. Share your perspective. Disagree if you want. These conversations matter. They're how we collectively make sense of history. And subscribe. Because there are hundreds of stories like this one, kings and queens who changed the world, battles that shaped nations, decisions that altered the course of human civilization. And most of them have been forgotten, overlooked, or simplified beyond recognition. My goal is to bring them back, to tell them honestly, to show you the real people behind the legends, the complicated, flawed, brilliant, tragic human beings who made history. That's what we do here. We remember, we analyze, we understand. We refuse to let the past fade into simplified myths or comfortable lies. Because history isn't about memorizing dates and names, it's about understanding how we got here, what humans are capable of, what works and what doesn't, what lasts and what crumbles. It's about learning from those who came before us, their successes and their failures, their brilliance and their blindness. And maybe, just maybe, it's about doing better, building on their achievements while avoiding their mistakes, creating something that lasts not through fear and violence, but through wisdom and justice. That's the real lesson of Shaka Zulu. Not that we should emulate him, but that we should learn from him. Take what was brilliant and discard what was brutal. Understand what he got right and what he got wrong, and use that understanding to build something better. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about real history. Thank you for being willing to sit with complexity and contradiction instead of demanding easy answers. This is why we tell these stories. This is why they matter. And Shaka Zulu's story, for all its darkness and light, is one that needed to be told.